Hi, and welcome to our continuing study in the Gospel of Luke for Ladies Bible Class. I thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope that you will find this study profitable for you. In this presentation, we are in lesson 24 of our workbooks, and that is also covering Luke chapter 23, verses 26 through 56. So we will be concluding the chapter of Luke 23 in this lesson. The questions for our study begin on page 151. So if you have a workbook and would like to get that out to follow along, that would be great. Also need your Bible, turn to Luke chapter 23, and we may be turning to some of the other gospel accounts during our study. As you know, the crucifixion is one of the many events of Jesus's life that is covered in all four of the gospel writers because of its significance and because all of them wanted and needed to give their eyewitness account for our benefit. So we're possibly going to be referring over to some of the other gospel writers who add details that Luke does not. Now, we're going to meet a man named Simon at the beginning of our study, and that starts in verse 26 of Luke 23. A man named Simon, unfortunately, we don't know very much about him. We do know that where he was from a country called Cyrene, Cyrene, which is a city in Libya, west of Egypt. Whether he was in the city for the Passover feast, which was quite possible that he was, or if he was just traveling through, the scriptures do not make that part clear. All we know was that he happened to be on the city streets at the same time that they were leading Jesus away up the hill to be crucified. Now, it was customary for a person who had been condemned to be crucified that they were responsible for carrying their cross, which was made out of solid wood, up the hill to the hill of Calvary or Golgotha, where the crucifixion was going to take place. Crucifixions were always held outside the city walls. That was one of their laws. They didn't perform those executions inside the city. So this was on a hillside outside the city walls of Jerusalem. Jesus is so weak at this point after his entire night of trials and beatings and so on. He hasn't eaten, he hasn't slept, he's been beaten and whipped with a whip that broke open the large wounds on his back. And he's very weak at this point. So he's not going to be able to carry this very heavy cross across his back up the hill. So question 1 asks, what did they make Simon of Cyrene do? And that's answered in verse 26. Now, as they led him away, meaning Jesus, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. So this man apparently had no choice in the matter. He was just told this is what he was going to do. And so he did. He carried the cross after Jesus. Jesus was in front of him. He was following along after. This was a procession that was usually conducted when they did do executions. And we know that there were 2 other men who were described as robbers or criminals who also were in this procession up the hill to be crucified. So Simon is asked or told to carry the cross. This is the only record we have of this man. We have no other information about him in the scriptures. There are other men named Simon. It was not an uncommon name, but we don't know if it was the same Simon or not. But this man was asked to do something very important. Whether he recognized the significance of it, of course, we do not know. So they have arrived at the part where the crucifixion will be taking place. Verse 27 tells us that there was a great multitude of people who followed along in this procession, including women who had been with Jesus from Galilee. They traveled with him, they ministered to him, and helped in whatever way they could in carrying out Jesus and carrying out his ministry, whether that included cooking, the procuring of food, or other duties that they performed for Jesus. They did that. And we learn that in Luke chapter 8, verses 2 through 3, where it describes a little bit more about what these women did. They are here at this particular occasion. They are walking behind the procession of the men and soldiers, and they're weeping and lamenting and mourning because they are deeply saddened by the fact that Jesus is going to be killed. Now, even under the strain and physical pain that Jesus was experiencing, he still takes time out from that to turn, he says in verse 28, and speak to these women. He tells them, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. He did not want them to weep for him. There was no need to. He was fulfilling God's will here. This was something that had to be done for the benefit of all, including these women. He says, but weep for yourselves and for your children, because of this event, because of the rejection of Jesus as the Messiah by the Jewish leaders and many of the Jewish people, a great destruction was going to come upon the city and the citizenship of that city. He's predicted it, he has prophesied about it, he has warned about it, and now he's telling these women that there will come a time when the mourning for the city will be in greater need than the mourning for me. Jesus was definitely going to be tortured and killed, but he would rise again and then go to be home with his Father. Whereas the city of Jerusalem was going to be completely and utterly destroyed. Many of these women's family members, if not they themselves, might possibly be killed. So the coming destruction was something that was far greater to mourn over than the coming execution of Jesus. Question 2 asks, what would some of the Jews one day ask of the mountains and hills? And that comes from verses 29 and 30. For indeed, the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren wombs that never bore, and breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. So the coming destruction was going to be so massive and so brutal that people were going to actually plead that they be buried so they didn't have to be in witness of it or have to deal with the suffering that would come from it. And these women were to count themselves blessed if they had no children or were not nursing children when this destruction came, because then their grief would be even greater. So he's comparing here his execution with the destruction of Jerusalem. We know that the destruction of Jerusalem was brought upon the city in AD 70. Secular history tells us this. It would be a terrible, terrible, massive slaughter of millions of Jews, and many more taken captive and carried away from their land. This was going to happen because this act of injustice against Jesus, the Son of God, would not go unpunished, even though Jesus warned the leaders many times that they were bringing destruction upon themselves and their own people. We know that from last week when they said, we will gladly take the responsibility of this death upon us and our children. They didn't fully understand what that statement meant. A lot of people say things like that in the heat of emotional upheaval, and then they bring consequences upon themselves they had no idea were going to happen. And that's certainly the case here. He goes on to say in verse 31, for if they do these things in the green wood, what would be done in the dry? He's comparing two kinds of wood. Green wood would be a tree that was alive. It still had life in it. It still had purpose, as opposed to dry wood, which of course is done. It's not alive, it's dead. So he's making the comparison here that if your leaders are going to put to death an innocent man who had no reason to be executed, what will they do to the dry, to the dead, to the wicked? So we're also comparing righteous and wicked here. Righteous representing the green wood, wicked representing the dry wood. So if the innocent and righteous are going to be punished in the way that Jesus was, what was going to happen to those that were wicked? And that, of course, is part of the destruction that comes upon these people. The city is never rebuilt the way it was during this time. The nation of Israel never regained their acclaim or their power that they wished to, as in the days of David. That was their hope. That was what they thought the Messiah was coming to do. That, of course, did not happen because that wasn't the purpose of the Messiah coming. And so they're going to suffer greatly for this. So Jesus wants them to reserve their mourning for that time rather than mourn him. All right, there were the two criminals in verse 22 that we see that were also crucified with Jesus, one on each side of Jesus. So there were 3 crosses. Could have been more, but a lot of times these crucifixions were massive. They had a lot of people at the same time. The soldiers, Roman soldiers, were required to carry these crucifixions out. They were under orders to do it in a certain way, and there were certain things they were required to do. So a lot of times these soldiers were not doing what they wanted to do, but rather what they were ordered to do. They bring Jesus to the place, they lay the cross down on the ground. The person is laid on top of the cross, and then they are nailed with very massive, large iron stakes to the cross. So the stakes go through the hand or through the wrist and into the wood. And then they stand the wooden cross up and drop it into a hole where they then make the cross stand on its own. This was a procedure these soldiers had done many, many, many times, but none of them recognized the significance of this particular one until later after he's dead. All right, it says in verse 33, and when they had come to the place called Calvary, which is the name of the hillside where they crucified Jesus. It's also called Golgotha in the scriptures, depending on what language, whether it's the Aramaic or Greek or Hebrew language. 2 criminals are also crucified, and they were condemned to death because of crimes they had committed. So they are going to be crucified at the same time. As they're hanging there on the cross, there is some conversation that goes on. The first thing we read of is in verse 34, and that's question 3. What did Jesus say that shows his mercy even when wronged? And that, of course, is the famous saying that Jesus makes, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Now, he's more than likely referring to the soldiers who are the ones actually doing the crucifixion. He's talking about the Jewish people who have no understanding of who he is, and of the Roman officials that were involved that also did not know who he was. So he's asking his Father to forgive them while they are crucifying him. So just think about that for a moment. How often do we have the presence of mind to forgive the people that are harming us during the actual time they're harming you? Certainly after the wrong has been committed, we might reflect upon it and say this. But very often we do not while it's actually happening to us, because we're in the midst of emotional upheaval, we're being hurt, we're in anguish of some kind. And so very, very frequently, or I would say not very frequently, do we actually think of forgiving the people that are harming us during that moment. Jesus does. which gives us a wonderful example of how we are to feel towards those that harm us, even if we are wronged and it's not something we deserve. We are to have forgiveness in our heart towards these people. We are not to wish them harm or seek to do them harm or wish any ill upon them because they have caused ill upon us. We are to have this attitude of compassion that Jesus shows on the souls of his enemies while he's dying on the cross. Remember that Jesus died for each and every living being that had lived and will live. He wants all to come to repentance. He does not want to see one soul lost. So this statement he makes then helps us to see the depth of his compassion on the souls of men, even the ones who have no idea what they're doing. He wants them also to be able to find forgiveness. All right, then the soldiers at the foot of the cross who stand guard over these people being crucified to make sure that the crucifixion is carried out properly and that onlookers don't get too intruding or involved in what's happening to the individual. There's also a custom where they would take the belongings of the person being crucified and the soldiers divide those things among themselves. So that's what we see happening in verse 34 after Jesus makes his statement. Now, John tells us that there were 4 soldiers present because they're dividing his clothing into 4 parts until they come to his tunic, which would be like a large cloak or cape that the men of their day wore. It was an outer garment that they wore to protect them from the cold, the wind, and often it was used to sleep under as a blanket. So it was usually rather large. They find out that this tunic is all of one piece of cloth. It's not seamed at all. It's all one large piece, which would make it very valuable because all cloth in their day was hand woven or spun. And so to make a garment of this size all in one piece took a lot of time and effort and materials. So they decide not to divide that particular piece of clothing into pieces, but rather to keep it whole. And then they're going to cast lots for it. We learned this in I think it's also in John, that they cast lots, which is kind of like we do with dice, where you throw the dice and whoever has the lowest or highest number, is the winner, so to speak. That's what they're doing here to determine which soldier will be the possessor of this tunic. So whatever earthly possessions a criminal had at the time of his crucifixion, the soldiers divvied up among themselves, and they took that property as a booty or as a, whatever you want to call it when you conquer someone. If we turn to John chapter 19, verse 23, it says, Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top to in one piece. They said among themselves, Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be. Now, this was a fulfillment of scripture where it was prophesied that his garments would be divided and cast lots for. Now, the mocking and the sneering of these people being crucified apparently continues on, even while they're hanging there, dying and suffering. People walk by and say things to them. And it says in verse 35, And the people stood looking on, and even the rulers sneered at Jesus, saying, Well, he saved himself. Why doesn't he saved others, or he says he saved others. Why doesn't he save himself? This was a taunting, humiliating thing to say. And of course, Jesus did have the power to do that very thing. He could have called himself down off that cross. He could have called any kind of punishment he wished upon these people, but he does not. He submits to what is happening because it is his Father's will, which is what he came to earth to do. So, of course, the soldiers and the rulers have no idea. The rulers should have known. They were supposed to be students of the law. But of course, we know they were blinded by their prejudice and hatred. The soldiers join in with this mocking, which was probably a common occurrence to someone who's dying or being killed, executed. You say things, like well, good riddance, or you deserve this, or I'm so glad you're being punished, or whatever it might be that people say. Certainly a very large contrast here between the compassion Jesus shows to his fellow human beings, where he asks for them to be forgiven, and then they turn around and mock and sneer at him and show no compassion upon him for what he's enduring. Even if he were a condemned criminal, you certainly, if you watched a crucifixion and were able to see firsthand the suffering these people go through during this, what kind of heart would you have if you didn't have compassion? At least a small amount of sympathy for what these individuals are enduring. But they do not. They are continuing to mock him, sneer at him, say all sorts of things to him to make it more humiliating for Jesus to have to endure. All right, then there's also a custom to put a sign at the head of the cross above the individual's head. And it was nailed to the cross as well. And it was to signify the crime for which the individual was being crucified for. That way, onlookers could walk by and see this person's being crucified for stealing. This person's being crucified for murder. This person's being crucified for insurrection, or whatever the crime might be. In Jesus's case, Pilate writes a sign that says, "This is the King of the Jews," or in another one of the gospel writers, they put his name up, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." So that's what his crime is, that he said he was or claimed to be the King of the Jews, which of course is absolutely true, but they misunderstood its significance. The signs were typically written in 3 languages, which would be the 3 languages that were commonly spoken in the Jerusalem area during this time. Greek being the universal language that all people spoke within the Roman Empire after the influence of Alexander the Great. And we are answering question 4, in what 3 languages was the sign written, which was over Jesus. Pilate is the one that wrote this sign. He's the one that wrote it in the 3 languages. Latin was the language of the Romans. Mostly the Roman soldiers or the Roman army spoke Latin. And then, of course, Hebrew being the Jewish language. So there would have been people from all over the Roman Empire in Jerusalem at this time for the feast. So the sign was written in languages that all people could read. We are familiar with that in our culture today, where many times public places are marked with signs in different languages to aid those who are there who may not be able to read English. So in this case, they had the 3 languages. Now, let's turn back to John 19, because there is a dispute among the Jewish leaders over what Pilate wrote. They're not through arguing and giving Pilate a difficult time here. He already consented to the crucifixion, which was against his better judgment, and they're still taunting at him and pressing him to do things. So if we look at verse 21 of John 19, it says, "Therefore, the chief priest of the Jews said to Pilate, 'Do not write the King of the Jews, but write, he said, I am the King of the Jews.'" They didn't want people walking by and seeing that sign thinking that they were killing their king. They wanted it written that this is what the man claims he is, not that he really is the king. Pilate's answer in verse 22 indicates that he's through. giving in to these people. He's through with their demands and their pressure that they've put on him. He says in verse 22, what I have written, I have written. In other words, I'm not changing it. So what he wrote stayed that way. And of course, he wrote the truth, even though he probably wasn't aware of it, because he didn't understand who Jesus truly was, as did many, many of the Jewish people. So it stood as he had written it. He does not change it. He refuses to give in to what these men are demanding. He's through giving in to their demands, finally. Unfortunately, not soon enough to save Jesus this terrible, terrible death. But then, of course, we know that this is something that he had to go through. All right. Now, there's another conversation that goes on while Jesus is on the cross between he and the thieves, the two thieves. They're called thieves or criminals, depending on which gospel account you're reading. One was on each side of Jesus. So Jesus is in the middle, and there's a criminal or robber on each side of him. And they are talking. One of the thieves joins in with the mocking and the sneering, verse 39 of Luke 23. Then one of the criminals who was hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you are the Christ, save yourself and us. So the other criminal on the other side of Jesus, verse 40, rebukes him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? What are you doing? Why are you condemning and blaspheming this man when you're dying too? You're being condemned. And then he goes on in verse 41, which is the answer to question number 5. How did the thief compare his punishment with that of Jesus? In verse 41 of Luke 23, he says, and we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. So he's talking to the other thief or criminal on the cross. And he said, we're being punished justly because we broke the law. This is what we deserve. However, Jesus is being condemned for nothing he did wrong. How this man knew this, we of course do not know. He possibly was a believer. He possibly had heard Jesus teach or knew about the events that had occurred surrounding Jesus's trial and so on. And he came to the conclusion that Jesus was also innocent. So he's making a confession here as he hangs on the cross because of his understanding that Jesus was innocent and was being unjustly put to death. Then in verse 42, he makes a request of Jesus. He says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He wanted Jesus to give him some compassion, mercy, forgiveness, all of those things when you come into your kingdom. So Jesus, knowing the heart of all men, knowing their intents, their motives, their thoughts, the whole thing, he understood this man to have made a true confession of who Jesus was, and he confessed of his belief in Jesus. So he has granted his request by Jesus. Jesus tells him in verse 43, assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So this criminal who made his confession, who defended Jesus while he was on the cross with him, is going to be in paradise with Jesus at the time of his death. Now, we know that paradise, we've studied this before back in Luke 16 about the rich man and Lazarus, that paradise is the place where the souls of the dead await judgment. Paradise is usually referred to, sometimes Abraham's bosom, as the place where the righteous souls will await the final judgment. So that is where Jesus goes for the 3 days that he's in the grave. And it's also where this criminal will go after his death because of the confession he made while on the cross. So again, we see the great compassion of Jesus during a most difficult time where he has the wherewithal, the presence of mind, whatever you want to call it, that he can show compassion to people who are guilty of sin. This man was being crucified because he was guilty, but Jesus shows him compassion. So sometimes when we're confronted with people who have done us wrong or have done things that are wrong, and we want to judge them and be harsh towards them and say that, well, whatever happens to you, you deserve, we are not showing the kind of compassion that Jesus showed while he was on the cross. So something to think about when we quite frequently jump to that harsh judgment situation in our minds, instead of taking a moment, taking a step back, and thinking about the fact that everybody makes sins, makes mistakes. We are all sinners, all, no matter who we are or what our station in life is. We're all deserving of death because of our sins. All right, now we're going to approach the time where Jesus is close to death. A lot of times people hung on the cross, sometimes for days before they died, depending on the physical condition and age, obviously, of the individual. But in Jesus's case, he is spared a great deal of that by only having to hang on the cross and endure this torturous death for only 6 hours. It tells us in verse 44 that it was about the 6th hour. Okay, he's been hanging on the cross since 9 a.m., which would be the 3rd hour of the morning. The times, their hours start counting from 6 a.m. our time. So he was crucified at 9 a.m. He's been hanging on the cross now. It's about the 6th hour, so we're talking about 3 more hours. And there became a great darkness that fell over the entire earth, not just Jerusalem or the Palestine area. The entire earth was under darkness for 3 hours until the 9th hour, signifying the significance of the death that was occurring, for the sin that had drove these people to do what they did, and the fact that Jesus is now carrying the sins of the world on his soul. That's what he's dying for. He's dying for the sins of all of us. He's paying the price for what we deserve for our sins. So there's darkness signifying evil, signifying a time of great grief and mourning. And so that's why we have this. And this was darkness at a time of day when it had to be a miracle that there was darkness. There was no way to explain it any other way. It wasn't a solar eclipse. It wasn't, a cloudy day or whatever you want to say. It was darkness. And it was in the middle of the day. So that was something that caught a lot of people's attention. I'm sure they were all stunned and perplexed as to what was happening. But why would it be darkened? It says in verse 45, the sun was darkened. So it wasn't just a solar eclipse, like I said. The sun was darkened. Something done by God the Father. And the next thing that happens is the veil of the temple. Oh, I'm sorry, we answered question 6. How long was there darkness over the earth at his confession or crucifixion? 3 hours, from noon to 3 p.m. So we just answered that one. Sorry about that. I quite frequently get ahead of myself on the questions. All right. So next thing that happens is the veil of the temple is torn in two. The veil was a curtain that hung between the holy place and the Holy of Holies in the temple. It was to divide the part of the temple where the priests could come in and carry out their duties, but they never entered the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest could enter into that area of the temple. It's where the Ark of the Covenant was. It's where the mercy seat was. It's where the high priest took blood once a year to offer for the sins of the people. It was a very, very special holy place that no one else was allowed to enter into. So when the veil was ripped or torn, that signified that that division is no longer in place. Now, anyone who is a child of God can enter into and approach the throne of grace and receive and be in the presence of God. It's no longer only the priest that could do that. And then the fact that if it was torn into from the top to the bottom, which one of the gospel writers tells us, is very unusual. You would think that it would tear from the bottom to the top. Also, this fabric was quite thick. And so for it to tear just suddenly, no one touched it, it just ripped. That would be an unusual happening as well. If we go to Matthew 27, we get some more details about this veil. This happened at the same time or about the same time as the darkness occurred. So if there were priests in the temple at the time, they would have observed this. Matthew 27, and we want to go to verse 51. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went up into the holy city and appeared to many. So there were a number of miraculous events that all happened in succession here at about the time of Jesus' death. We have the darkness. We have the veil of the temple tearing. We have an earthquake. We have the rocks being split unnaturally. I mean, this was all miraculously done. We have bodies of people who were dead and buried rising up out of their graves and being seen in the city. We do not know who these people are. All we know that Matthew says is they were saints. So it would have been believers or those obedient to the law of Moses. Were resurrected. For how long? We do not know. We have no other details about this except that that would have been a miraculous event that was seen and witnessed by many people in the city. At the ninth hour, Jesus cries out with a loud voice, and that's question 7, which asks, what were the last words spoken by Jesus? And that is in verse 46. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Other gospel writers word it a little bit different, that Jesus says, it is finished. I give up my spirit. He's doing this all willingly. He knows where he's going. He's going to be with his Father. He's giving his spirit or saying, take my spirit, that he was very, very near death at this time. And these are the last words that he speaks on earth, where he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, knowing he was going to be in good hands. The Lord knew that his Father would take care of him and would fulfill all through him. When he says, in one of the other gospel writers says, it is finished, indicating that his mission on earth had been completed. He had fulfilled all prophecies, and he had done everything his Father wanted done. All right, so we see then in verse 47 something very interesting that happens at the time that Jesus passes away. Having said this, he breathed his last. So he was on the cross for about 6 hours, and then he passes away. When the centurion saw what had happened, verse 47, referring up to the earthquake, the darkness, all of that, he says, he glorifies God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. In a couple of the other gospel accounts, he says, truly, this was the Son of God. He understood at that moment who this man really was. And he makes a confession of his own here, that we've crucified the Son of God because of what he had witnessed, all of the miraculous events that had occurred. Verse 48 says, let's see if I'm going to move this question. Question number 8. What did the centurion do when he saw what was done? He made a confession. He understood in that moment who Jesus was. The next thing that happens in verse 48, the whole crowd who came together to that site. So they've stayed around during this 6 hours that Jesus has been on the cross, just standing or sitting or watching nearby. When they saw what was done, they beat their breasts and returned, I'm assuming, to their homes or wherever they were staying. So the beating of the breast is an indication that something very emotionally upsetting has occurred. They either beat their breasts out of anger over what had been done, or they beat their breasts over that they were upset over what had happened. We do not know for certain. We have no other information other than this, but the beating of the breasts normally indicates some type of emotional upheaval, anger, you're upset, you don't like what has happened. So whether they were angry at the death of Jesus, they were angry over what had happened at his death with all the darkness, the earthquake, and so on, we're not told, but they had a reaction, an emotional reaction to his death. Verse 49 says that his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. So they were eyewitnesses of all that had occurred, his crucifixion, the darkness, the earthquake, the rocks splitting, and so on. And the words he spoke while he was on the cross. More than likely, they heard those things as well. The other thing that Jesus does do while he's on the cross before his death is he addresses his mother. He says to her, "Woman, behold your son." And then he says to John, the apostle, who was also there, "Behold your mother." So he shows honor and love and compassion to his mother, who he knows is enduring this horrible sight, having to watch her son be killed in this manner. And he wants to make sure she's cared for, and gives her into the care of one of the disciples whom John describes himself as the one whom Jesus loved, apparently someone he had deep love for and who he trusted. And so he gives the care of his mother into John's hands. It tells us in John chapter 19, verse 25 through 27, written by the man himself, John, he took her home with him that day. She more than likely was a widow by this time. She would have had to have been, otherwise she wouldn't have needed care. And her other sons, we do not know why they were not commissioned to take care of her, but Jesus, being the oldest of her children, took it upon himself to make sure his mother would be cared for after his death. Again, showing great compassion during a difficult time. And so we know that Mary went to live with John. Secular history tells us that she remained with John until her death. John later moves to the city of Ephesus, where he is a great leader in the church, the early establishment of the church, and that she goes with him to Ephesus and remains there with him until her death. We know later that Jesus's brothers, some of them anyway, become believers. We know in the beginning of his ministry, they did not believe. But later, John 7, chapter 7, verse 5 tells us that his brothers didn't believe who he really was. But later, two of his brothers we know did become believers. His brother James, who wrote the book of James, and we see in Acts chapter 15, was one of the major leaders of the church in Jerusalem. His brother Judas, sometimes called Jude, wrote the book of Jude in the New Testament. So they became believers. They became workers in the early church. We don't know about the other brothers. And he also had sisters, which we don't know anything else about as well. So his family, some became believers. We're hoping all did, and became workers in the early church. All right. Now the bodies of the crucified had to be removed from the crosses before sundown on the day before the Sabbath. So this being Friday night, sundown Friday night would start the Sabbath day, or Passover as it was in this case. So the bodies had to be removed. That was a rule, a Jewish rule. I don't think the Romans cared about the Sabbath, but the Jews did. So the body needs to be removed. And normally they would either throw these bodies in a mass grave, or they would let family members take them, or they would just bury them in a field where they buried people they didn't care about. So we know that from prophecy, Jesus is going to be buried in a rich man's tomb. So we meet Joseph of Arimathea. Can't even talk. And that's in verse 50. For behold, there was a man named Joseph, a council member, a good and just man. He had not consented in their decision. Indeed, he was from Arimathea, and a city of the Jews, who himself was also waiting for the kingdom of God. So this is our first acquaintance with Joseph. He is a Sanhedrin member, but he did not vote or agree to the condemnation of Jesus. It says he was a good and just man, and he was secretly a believer. There were two council members that we know were secretly believers, the other one being Nicodemus, who helps Joseph in this matter. Let's turn to John 19, and where we read how Nicodemus also aids in the burial of Jesus. This would have been a very, very courageous act for these two council members to making it known that they were going to be involved in the burial of this man, because if the other council members became aware, it could jeopardize their position in the council. At this point, they are not concerned about that. They're more concerned about the injustice of what has happened. It says that Joseph was a good and just man. He was not in agreement to the death of Jesus, and he was waiting for the kingdom of God himself. So John chapter 19, verse 30, we read about Nicodemus. Well, that's the verse I wrote down, but guess what? It's not the right one. So let me keep reading until I find it. Verse 38. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took the body of Jesus. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. So we see these two men aiding each other in the burial of Jesus. Joseph is the one that goes to Pilate and to get permission to take the body, because they were still under the guard of the Roman soldiers, so you couldn't just walk up and take the body. Now, when they come to Pilate and he asks for the body, Pilate is surprised to hear that Jesus is already dead, because, like I said, typically it takes much longer for that to happen. We read that earlier in John chapter 19. See, is it in John? Maybe it's in, I don't remember what gospel writer it's in. Maybe it's in Mark or Matthew, that he comes, Pilate can't believe that he's already dead. So he sends the soldier to verify. So the way they verify the death of a person on the cross is they take a sword and they pierce his side, that indicating whether they're dead or alive. And when they did that, blood and water came out of the side of Jesus. Now, sometimes they broke the legs of the people while on the cross to hurry up their death. If they needed to get the body off the cross and they wanted to clean up or whatever, they would break their legs, and this would speed up the dying process. They didn't do that to Jesus because he was already dead, which fulfilled two prophecies here, in the fact that he would be pierced, and second, that none of his bones would be broken. So our writer mentions those references in our book if you want to look those up yourself. So again, more prophecies being fulfilled. Now we have to take care of the burial. Like I said, they're running out of some time. It's already after 3 p.m. when Jesus dies. They have very few hours left before sundown, so they have to hurry and prepare the body and get it buried by sundown, because that's the official beginning of the Passover, and they're not allowed to work on the Sabbath or Passover day. It tells us back to Luke 23, and let's see, we're in verse 53. Then he took it down, meaning the body of Jesus, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb that was hewn out of the rock where no one had ever lain before. And that's one of our questions. That is question number 9. We've already talked about Joseph of Arimathea, what kind of man he was. Number 10 asks, what was particularly special about the sepulchre in which Jesus was buried? It was brand new and had been hewn out of stone. No one had ever been buried there. It was common to bury multiple people in these cave-like tombs that were hewn and carved out of solid rock. And they made an opening, and then there was a place where they could lay the body, and then they rolled some kind of thing in front of the hole so animals and other people could not get into the tomb. That was the typical way that Jews buried people in their day. So Joseph had a tomb already prepared, perhaps for his own self or maybe for his family, and he uses that to bury Jesus in. So he was buried in a rich man's tomb. He was buried in a brand new tomb. And we see in verse 55 that the women have not left. They're still there. They are observing all that has happened. It says in 55, and the women who had come with him from Galilee follow after, and they observe the tomb and how his body was laid. Now, as I said, they had to hastily prepare the body for burial. The typical way to prepare a body for burial in their day was to take linen strips that were either soaked or had spices rubbed on them. And then these linen strips were wrapped around the entire body. The entire body was covered because decay is going to occur, and they're going to try to hold those things together and then prevent it from smelling, because a decaying body has an odor that I've been told is very, very bad. I've never personally smelled one, but I understand it's a pretty bad odor. So they came up with a mixture of spices that they used. It tells us in one of the accounts I read that it was myrrh and aloe. It was an oil and a spice they mixed together, and then they soaked these linen strips in it, and then they wrapped the body in it, and that was their customary way. So these men hurriedly did that because they were running out of time before the sundown of that day. So the women observe where that tomb is and how they prepared him for burial. And then we see in verse 56 that they do return to their homes or the homes of someone they knew and prepared spices and fragrant oils. So they're going to complete the burial process in a more thorough manner when they are allowed to after the Sabbath Passover day. So it says they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. They're being faithful Jewish women. That's what they do, but they are going to return to the tomb and finish the burial process, where they're allowed to give it a more thorough treatment, because the men had to hurriedly do it on Friday evening. So they're going to return on Sunday, which would be the day after the Sabbath day. This is important that we note that they knew exactly where the tomb was. That's why they followed along, to make sure they were aware. They're going to make sure Jesus is cared for properly even after death, because of their great love for him. None of these people understood what had happened. They didn't. They thought Jesus was dead, buried, and it was over, that he was no longer going to be able to do anything for them. All of their hopes and wishes and promises were, according to them, at this point anyway, over. They did not understand the resurrection. Even though Jesus had told them he would rise again in 3 days, they did not fully grasp the meaning of that. So they think this burial is final and that they will never see him again. And so they want to show their great honor, respect, and love for him by preparing his body with a lot of spices, which were expensive in their day, but they're going to give all that because of their love for Jesus. All right, let's look at our true and false questions. Jesus told the daughters of Jerusalem to weep over the fact of his death. This is false. He did not want them to weep for him. He tells them that in verse 28. Number 2, the rulers mocked Jesus, but the soldiers did not. This is false. We see in verses 35 and 36 that both groups mocked him. The rulers, of course, we knew they were going to because they were the ones that put him there. The soldiers join in, probably just, monkey see, monkey do kind of situation, because they had no understanding, of course, being Roman, of the Jewish situation, of who the Messiah was. Number 3, the veil of the temple was rent in the midst, meaning in the middle. That's true. Verse 45 tells us that it was torn from top to bottom, down the middle of this very thick piece of fabric, just suddenly torn. No one touched it. No one had anything to do with what happened to it. Number 4, Joseph had agreed to the death of Jesus and later repented. This is false. Verse 51 tells us he did not consent to the deed. So apparently it wasn't required to have a unanimous vote of all 70 council members. It was probably a majority vote, and he voted against it. Number 5, the day of his crucifixion was the preparation day for the Sabbath. And this is true. We learn that in verse 54. I want to go back to true and false question number 4 for just a moment. If we think again about why Joseph had not committed or consented to the death of Jesus, usually the men on the Sanhedrin Council were very learned and wise men. And in Joseph's determination, they had not brought significant evidence to the wrongdoing of anything Jesus had done against the law of Moses. And secondly, he believed that Jesus was the Messiah. So he knew there was no sin or guilt on Jesus' soul, which is why he did not consent to the death, which took, again, a great deal of courage for him to do that. He stood up for what was right, which was what Pilate should have done, but we see Pilate taking a different road. All right, research question asks us to read the accounts in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and John 19, and then asks what scripture was fulfilled when the soldiers did not break his legs, but pierced his side with a spear. Matthew is tremendously well versed in referring back to the fulfillment of prophecy. The audience that Matthew wrote to was the Jews, his Jewish brethren, and he wanted to provide significant proof to them that all of the things that happened were a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, and that they had killed the Son of God because of their misunderstanding or ignorance of what or who Jesus was. If we look over in Matthew chapter 27, verse 35, we read that this is the fulfillment of a prophecy from the book of Psalms. Psalms 22 being one of the chapters or Psalms where it speaks about a lot of prophecy regarding the death of Jesus. So it was a fulfillment of prophecy for sure. It wasn't just accidental or coincidental that these things happened. This was all part of God's plan from the beginning. There was significance. There was a reason. When you sacrificed a lamb for the Passover under the old law, it had to be a healthy lamb with no broken bones. If it had broken bones, you could not use it as a sacrificial lamb. So we see that shadowing of that then in the sacrifice of Jesus being the Lamb of God. He had to have no broken bones to be the perfect sacrifice. So again, there's always significance in these prophecies. The piercing, they had to pierce the lamb's body to drain the blood out before they sacrificed it. And so we see that same thing being done to the body of Jesus. The thought question asks that if the thief on the cross did not have to be baptized to be saved, does this prove baptism is not necessary today? And if so, why? All right, let's talk about this thief on the cross. When did he die? He died either the same day or shortly after Jesus did. What law was in force at the death of Jesus? The law of Moses. So baptism was not a part of the Old Testament law. Baptism is part of the New Testament law. That's where we're commanded to be baptized and buried with Jesus in the water, like he was buried in the earth. So the thief lived under the Old Testament law, which meant he was not required to be baptized before he repented and confessed his belief in Jesus. And he confessed of his sin, we are certain of, that he had committed that caused him to be condemned. So his death occurred before the new law became in effect. So therefore, baptism was not required for him. Now, all the souls who lived under the old law and who were faithful and obedient to that law and were found righteous in the eyes of God were saved by the blood of Christ, because when Jesus died on the cross, was resurrected, and the new law was put into effect on the day of Pentecost, that blood was able to go back and save the souls of all the Old Testament saints who lived under the old law. They were not baptized either. Elijah, Moses, David, these men were obedient to the law of Moses and therefore were found righteous. So that's how that works. It's like the high priest going into the Holy of Holies once a year, and he would offer the blood for all the sins that had committed that entire year. So the blood covers the sins of the Old Testament saints, and it would cover the sins of the thief on the cross as well, because he died under the old law. I hope that made that clear for you. It is a question that does come up from time to time when people want to excuse themselves from baptism, or perhaps had a loved one who passed away before they could be baptized, and that question is asked. And in those cases, in fact, I was just asked this the other day. My husband was very ill and he died before he was able to be baptized, physically able. And he made his confession. He asked for forgiveness of sins, but because of his physical condition, they could not baptize him. Is he saved? My answer to that question is that is in the jurisdiction of God's judgment. It's not for us to make a decision in that way. God knows the hearts of each and every one of us. And if he grants a person in that condition salvation, that is entirely within his jurisdiction, if you will allow me that term. He can make that decision. So I do not put people in distress in telling them no, if they weren't baptized physically, they were not saved, because that's something I am not in the position to make a decision on. And we need to be careful that we don't judge things that we do not have either the understanding of or the right to make a judgment in that way. All right, so that takes care of lesson 24. We are now at the beginning of Luke chapter 24. 24, which we begin next presentation. We're going to actually get two lessons out of chapter 24. Lesson 25 and lesson 26 are going to be from the the chapter of Luke 24. It is a rather long chapter. It has a total of 53 verses. So our writer's going to split that in two, and we're going to talk about his resurrection and the trip with the two men on the road to Emmaus, And then in lesson 26, our final lesson in this workbook, we will talk about his appearance to the disciples and his ascension. Luke is the only gospel writer that talks about the ascension of Jesus. And of course, Luke again talks about it in Acts chapter 1. So we will take those subjects up next time. I thank you for tuning in and watching. I hope you found these lessons profitable. I do notice from time to time when I rewatch some of my presentations that my sound quality is somewhat garbled every once in a while, or it skips. And that's because of the condition of my computer. I am using an older laptop for my presentations. And sometimes it gets a little garbled when I'm talking, and I do apologize that the quality of that is not as it should be, but I do the best I can with what I have to work with. Anyway, I thank you again for watching, and hopefully you will do the same next time. Thank you.